Imagine parking your Jeep on your own ranch only to have an HOA Karen call the cops, claiming it's an eyesore. Then Grandpa steps out in his sheriff uniform, and her world flips upside down. If you love epic HOA drama, Karen meltdowns, and small-town justice, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more wild stories like this one. The sun beat down on the sprawling acres of Willow Creek Ranch, where dust swirled lazily around Jake's weathered Jeep, parked just beyond the rickety wooden fence that marked the edge of his family's property. The ranch, a patchwork of golden fields and gnarled oaks, had been in Jake's family for 3 generations, a haven of freedom where rules were few and the horizon stretched endless. But freedom, it seemed, had a new enemy: Margaret Hensley, the self-appointed queen of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Margaret, with her tightly permed hair and a clipboard perpetually clutched to her chest, had been a thorn in Jake's side ever since the HOA annexed the outskirts of the ranch into its jurisdiction 2 years ago. The land, once untouchable, now fell under her watchful, judgmental gaze. Jake, a rugged 32-year-old with a penchant for flannel and a deep love for his family's legacy, had no patience for her petty decrees. His Jeep, a mud-splattered relic from his college days, was his pride and joy, a symbol of his independence. But to Margaret, it was a blight on her vision of suburban perfection. She'd been circling like a vulture, leaving notes taped to the Jeep's windshield, each one more passive-aggressive than the last. Please park in a less conspicuous location, or vehicles must be in pristine condition per HOA guidelines. Jake ignored them, tossing the notes into the glove box with a chuckle. This was his land, his rules, or so he thought. Margaret's campaign began in earnest one sweltering July morning. Jake woke to the sound of gravel crunching under tires, a sound that didn't belong on the quiet ranch. Peering through the blinds of the old farmhouse, he spotted a sleek black SUV idling near his Jeep. Margaret emerged, her floral dress pristine despite the dust, her phone already pressed to her ear. She paced, gesturing wildly at the Jeep, her voice carrying snippets of indignation. Unsightly, non-compliant, eyesore. Jake's stomach churned. He knew she wasn't just complaining to a friend, she was escalating. Sure enough, within the hour, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up the dirt path, its lights lazily flashing. Jake's heart sank, but not for long. His grandfather, Amos, a wiry 78-year-old with a face carved from years of sun and hard work, was already stepping out onto the porch, his boots thudding with purpose. Amos had been the county sheriff for 4 decades before retiring, and though he'd hung up his badge, his presence still commanded respect. Jake watched as Amos adjusted his Stetson, his old sheriff's uniform, kept pristine for special occasions, gleaming in the sunlight. Margaret didn't notice him yet, too busy pointing at the Jeep as she lectured the deputy. A young man barely out of training, the deputy, nervous under Margaret's barrage, scribbled notes as she ranted about the Jeep's chipped paint and its inappropriate parking spot on what she called community-adjacent land. Jake leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Margaret's voice grew shriller, her accusations veering into the absurd. The Jeep was lowering property values, encouraging delinquency, even posing a safety hazard. The deputy, clearly out of his depth, nodded along, unsure how to handle this firestorm of a woman. But Amos had seen enough. He strode toward the trio, his boots kicking up dust, his uniform catching the light. Margaret froze mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she registered the star on Amos's chest, the authority in his stride. The deputy snapped to attention, recognizing Amos instantly. Jake couldn't hear the exchange from the porch, but he saw Margaret's face cycle through confusion, defiance, then a flicker of fear. Amos's calm, steady voice cut through her bluster, and within minutes the deputy was tipping his hat, climbing back into his cruiser, and driving off. Margaret stood alone, clutching her clipboard like a shield, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. Jake smirked, thinking the matter settled. But Margaret's eyes locked onto his, and he saw something dangerous there, a resolve that promised this was far from over. The days that followed were deceptively quiet. Jake went about his work, tending to the ranch's cattle and mending fences, assuming Margaret had been cowed by Amos's intervention. But Margaret was not one to retreat. She spent her evenings poring over HOA bylaws, her dining room table buried under legal pads and highlighted documents. The Jeep, she decided, was her hill to die on. If Jake thought he could flaunt his disregard for her authority, he was mistaken. She began rallying her allies in the HOA board, a group of equally fastidious neighbors who shared her vision of a pristine, uniform community. They drafted a formal complaint, citing obscure clauses about vehicle aesthetics and parking regulations. Margaret even hired a lawyer, a slick city type who promised to bury Jake in fines and liens if he didn't comply. Notices began arriving at the ranch, each one more threatening than the last. Jake tossed them into a drawer, refusing to engage, but the pressure was mounting. The HOA's letters hinted at legal action, property seizures, even foreclosure if the fines went unpaid. Jake's carefree attitude began to crack. He loved the ranch, not just for its land, but for what it represented. His family's history, their defiance against a world that tried to box them in. Losing it to Margaret's crusade was unthinkable. Amos, ever the voice of reason, urged Jake to stay calm. He'd seen women like Margaret before, petty tyrants who thrived on control but crumbled under real resistance. Still, he knew the HOA's legal threats weren't entirely empty. The annexation had given them a foothold, and Margaret's lawyer was no amateur. Amos spent evenings on the phone with old contacts in the county office, pulling strings to understand the HOA's leverage. Meanwhile, Margaret escalated her tactics. She organized a neighborhood beautification campaign, rallying residents to report any violations on Jake's property. Suddenly, the ranch was under scrutiny for everything. An overgrown hedge, a rusty gate, even the chickens that roamed too close to the road. Jake felt the walls closing in. The ranch, once his sanctuary, was now a battleground. Late one night, as he sat on the porch with Amos, staring at the Jeep under the moonlight, he wondered if he'd underestimated Margaret. She wasn't just a nuisance, she was a force, relentless and unyielding. As the stars glittered above, a new letter arrived, slid under the gate in the dead of night. Jake opened it, his jaw tightening. It wasn't from the HOA, it was a court summons. Margaret was taking him to court over the Jeep, and the fight was about to get uglier. The battle lines were drawn, and Willow Creek buzzed with gossip. Margaret's campaign had split the community. Some neighbors, tired of her overreach, quietly rooted for Jake, slipping him tips about her next moves. Others, loyal to her vision of order, sent her photos of the Jeep, documenting its every scratch. Jake, once content to ignore the HOA, now found himself strategizing like a general. He and Amos pored over the summons, a dense document accusing him of violating multiple HOA covenants. The fines had ballooned to thousands, and the threat of a lien loomed large. Jake's temper flared. He wanted to drive the Jeep straight to Margaret's manicured lawn and leave it there. But Amos, with his decades of law enforcement wisdom, counseled patience. They needed to fight smart, not loud. Amos reached out to a retired lawyer friend, Clara, who'd handled land disputes in her day. Clara, a sharp-witted woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, agreed to take the case pro bono, relishing the chance to stick it to an overzealous HOA. She warned Jake that Margaret's lawyer was a shark. But the HOA's case wasn't airtight. The annexation of the ranch's outskirts was murky, rushed through during a poorly attended county meeting years ago. If they could challenge its legitimacy, they might unravel Margaret's entire crusade. Clara dove into the legal weeds, unearthing old county records and zoning maps. Meanwhile, Margaret doubled down. She organized a neighborhood meeting, standing at a podium in the community center, her voice dripping with righteous indignation as she painted Jake as a reckless rebel, thumbing his nose at community standards. The Jeep, she argued, was just the start. If Jake could flout the rules, others would follow, and Willow Creek would descend into chaos. Her supporters nodded fervently, but a few residents shifted uncomfortably, sensing her vendetta was personal. Jake didn't attend, knowing his presence would only fuel her fire. Instead, he worked with Clara, gathering evidence to counter the HOA's claims. Amos, meanwhile, played a quieter role, leveraging his reputation to sway local officials. He reminded them of the ranch's history, how it predated the HOA by decades, how his family had donated land for the town's park. His words carried weight, and whispers of dissent began to spread. Margaret, oblivious to the shifting tide, pushed forward, confident her legal muscle would crush Jake. She didn't know Clara had found a bombshell, a procedural error in the annexation that could invalidate the HOA's claim to the ranch entirely. As the court date loomed, tension gripped Willow Creek. Jake's Jeep, still parked defiantly by the fence, became a symbol: freedom to some, defiance to others. Margaret's SUV was a constant presence, circling the ranch like a predator. Jake felt the weight of the fight, not just for himself but for Amos, for the legacy they both cherished. Clara's discovery gave them hope, but the outcome was far from certain. The night before the hearing, Jake sat in the farmhouse kitchen, staring at a photo of his great-grandfather breaking ground on the ranch. Amos joined him, his sheriff's uniform hanging in the closet, a reminder of the authority he still wielded. They didn't speak, but the silence was heavy with resolve. Tomorrow they'd face Margaret in court, and the fate of the ranch hung in the balance. Whatever happened, Jake knew one thing: he wasn't backing down. If you're hooked on this HOA showdown, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell for the next chapters of this wild ranch saga.